Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about the mid-12th century play Babio. This is kind of not an homage necessarily, but it is a play that is clearly inspired by the works of Terence, the Roman comedian, the Roman comic playwright, who was incredibly popular in the medieval period. But, whereas Terence had a well-established dramaturgical tradition to draw from, and actually he would have seen probably tons and tons and tons of plays, and so he knew how stagecraft worked and things like this. By the time of Babio, you really don't have that tradition in Europe. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century, theater more or less disappears. I mean, there's still, folk performances, people still do, skits and things like that, because people do. We're imitative creatures, and often that imitation takes the form of acting, but you don't have sort of formal theater in the sense that the Greeks, the Romans, and then the early modern period has. Up until really about the 10th century, when you start to have a resurgence of interest in drama as literature and possibly drama as performance. And so Babio is in the sort of early vein of that. Again, mid-12th century, somewhere in there, mid-1100s, 1150, somewhere in that general vicinity. And so the author of Babio, or authors of Babio, depending, we don't know who wrote it, they didn't have that dramaturgical tradition to pull from. And so the play is not as solid as the works of Terence. But it's an interesting play nonetheless. So one of the things that is interesting about it is it actually gives us a lot of hints about how medieval dramatic literature worked, as well as some of the sort of ideology of the medieval period. What I mean by that is, again, they did not have a clear and well-established, long-existing tradition of writing drama. And so when people started writing dramas again, Vita of Gendersham sort of kicked things off, but then it picked up as you go into the 11th, 12th, 13th, and especially into the early modern period. But they didn't have a particularly solid tradition of it, and so they didn't necessarily know how to approach it in ways that would be functional for actors. So one of the things that sort of Babio, the manuscripts that exist, there's 7 manuscripts of Babio still in existence, a few of which are so read, so handled, so they're in such rough condition that they're really not useful. Of the 4 that exist, I think 3 are in England and 1 is in Germany. But one of the things that the earliest manuscript version has is what's called an incipit. And this is a sort of interesting opening bit. You can't really see this very well. This is sort of opening bit, right? I'm actually I will read this to you in just a second, but I want to talk through what the incipit does. The incipit is a sort of almost like a frontispiece in publishing, right? So if you think back to early modern frontispieces, it's more in depth than a title page on a modern book, right? So a title page today, this is basically what you get, right? This is I'm reading this out of Broadview Anthology of Medieval Drama, by the way. So you get, on a typical title page today, you get things like the title of the book, the author or editors in this case. You get the name of the press, if the press has a logo, that sort of stuff. But back in the early modern period, a frontispiece tended to have much more information. For instance, a frontispiece for a Shakespeare quarto might include the places where it was performed, the company that performed it, all this sort of information. A bunch of stuff, more information about the publisher, like their address, these sorts of things. An incipit is sort of like that. It gives you information about the text that you're about to read. It's not a title as such, because often early manuscript works didn't have titles in the way we think of them today, but they had these sort of introductory bits. And so the incipit for Babio is really interesting because it assumes, probably quite rightly, that readers are not going to know how to read medieval drama. And actually one of the things that makes it particularly hard, I've circled this. So you see here, the name Babio is listed in brackets, right? And then down here a little bit later, what does it say? He hears the noise of a dog barking, right? That's listed in brackets as well. What brackets mean in medieval, early modern, ancient texts, whatever it is typically that the editors have put this in. So the original manuscripts of Babio do not say Babio. The next character who comes in and speaks is Viola. It doesn't say Viola at the beginning of her lines, and then Babio when you go back to his speech, etc., etc. None of the stage directions are there. Entrances and exits aren't marked, etc., etc. So it actually is quite difficult to sort of read these texts and make sense of who's talking, what they're doing, when characters enter and exit, and things like this. And so the incipit in this case is meant to help us navigate that. So, what does it say? The incipit says, here begins the book about Babio the priest and Petula his wife, and about Photius the servant of Babio and Petula, and about Viola the daughter of Petula, and about Croesus the knight. So that's the opening sentence. Incidentally, if you're wondering about Babio the priest and Petula his wife, apparently up until the 11th century, it was perfectly fine for priests to get married, like parish priests and things like that. Monks weren't still supposed to, but there were reforms in the 11th century, according to the introduction in the Broadview Anthology, that attempted to ban priests getting married, and those did not go over well in Northern Europe. So mid-12th century, this would be about 75 years, maybe, or so, after those ecclesiastical reforms. And so Babio being married would be a slightly old-fashioned thing, but not unheard of. Then it goes on. In order that what these verses mean should be more clearly understood, I set out beforehand a kind of account for those reading them, to show right away how they are supposed to be performed, by whom, and how. Again, there's no stage directions, there's no listing of which characters speak which lines, and so the incipit is a kind of plot summary, a kind of gloss of the plot that gives us a sense of who is likely speaking based on what their sort of role is. The author of these verses introduces 5 principal characters, each speaking to the rest in turn, so that it should seem just as if it were a discussion were taking place right in front of those who are present. Again, you're assuming, if you're the author of this, that your readers do not understand how drama works, that they don't understand how dramaturgy and performance work. And so the idea that in a modern playwright's note you would say this should be performed as though these conversations are happening in front of the audience, people would say yes, That's acting. That's how that goes. So it's a note that like no one would make today because it simply is assumed. But if you don't come from a dramaturgical culture, you don't come from a culture that has performance, has theater, then that's not necessarily a safe assumption. So it goes on. And so there should be no ambiguity as to which character speaks. The names of the various characters are as follows: Babio, the wife Petula, Photius, Viola, Croesus. And it is worth noting that these are all significant names. Babio, according to the footnotes here, Babio probably is a name associated with babbling or babbler. Like he speaks a lot, and he's often it's often very contradictory, somewhat awkward speech. Petula would be connected to the Latin word for impudent, and indeed she kind of is. She helps Photius, whose name means prick, like to prick, the verb. She basically cuckolds Babio with Photius, and then they sort of scheme together to sort of, take advantage of him. You've got Viola, whose name is connected to violet, the flower, and violate, because she is the ingenue. She's the virgin who is desired both by Babio, her stepfather, and by Croesus. And then Croesus, whose name is associated with crocus or yellow, probably reflecting his cowardliness. So he is the braggart soldier of he's the braggart soldier. Viola is the ingenue. Photius is the sort of harlequin type figure, the cunning servant or cunning slave who desires wine, women, and song. Petula, I don't know. I don't know enough. I'm not sort of familiar enough necessarily with the archetypes of classical Roman comedy or commedia dell'arte or whatever it is to get Petula's exact correspondence. But then Babio is a sort of combination of the miser figure and the lustful old man. So these are all classical comic archetypes, basically. Okay, then it goes on. Babio was a priest, Petula his wife, Photius the household servant of Babio and Petula. Viola was the daughter of the latter, the daughter of the wife, and not the daughter of Babio, but his stepdaughter, as it were, whom both Babio and Photius love, which seems to be an error. Photius wants Viola out of the way so that he can pursue Petula. He doesn't seem to have any real affection for her. This probably means both Babio and Croesus love. Unknown to one another. Croesus was a certain knight, lord of the town where the girl was, and he was the lord of Babio the priest. This Croesus loved the girl Viola and wished to have her, and the priest was upset about that. Photius had an affair with the wife of the priest, that is, with Petula, and his master, in other words Babio, didn't know it, even though he had his suspicions. But Babio didn't care too much about that, for he loved the daughter more than the mother, and therefore keeps quiet, so much so that he doesn't want to talk to anyone, and even gives treats to dogs lest they should say anything, as if dogs knew how to talk. But all the same, he doesn't have an affair with her, he loved her in silence. That's why he says, I'm racked with pain, etc. And that's actually where the play begins. Babio comes on, I'm racked with pain from outside and within, if one more grief assails me, I'll break down. I can't reveal the cause which makes it worse, etc., etc. So, basically, this incipit is a plot summary. It tells you what happens so that the things that come after more or less make sense. Part of the reason that is important is because this was likely intended primarily as a teaching tool to help schoolboys, and this would have been boys. Girls did not really get an education in the mid-12th century. But it would have helped schoolboys to learn Latin. And so knowing what is going on actually makes it a lot easier to decipher what a text is doing and why. Also along those lines, there's a ton of classical references in this. One of the first we get is when Babio refers to this dog who shows up early in the play as Melampus. And Melampus was the one of the dogs of Actaeon, who in classical mythology gets turned into a deer or a stag by Artemis or Diana in Roman mythology. Artemis in Greek mythology, Diana in Roman. So you have these references to Helen, to the affair between, they use the Roman names, Venus, Mars, and Venus, Mars, and Vulcan. Sorry. Yeah, all of these things. And readers at the time, schoolboy readers who had classical educations, would have been expected to know these things. So that's, that's what that is. There's a couple of other things that I think are really interesting here that I want to talk briefly about. So one is some elements of sort of medieval, this one actually is connected to this, some elements of medieval rhetoric. And partially this is inspired by classical Latin rhetorical styles from the Romans. We have these elements of linguistic play. And I want to read you this section. This is about middle of the poem, or middle of the play, rather. Viola has just gone off with Croesus, despite earlier in the play having sort of falsely told Babio that she was into him and not Croesus. And so Babio is now sort of imagining them having sex, and he's despairing, and women are frailty, thy name is woman, bullshit thing going on. And what he says here is really kind of interesting structurally, because it does a couple of linguistically interesting things. One is that it utilizes proverbs, utilizes these sort of common wisdom sayings in new ways to make his rhetorical point. And the other is that it appeals to paradoxes in order to sort of understand his situation or represent his situation. So he says, force lays you low, Viola, pleasure's force. Paradox, right? The pleasure-pain dichotomy. It's no long shot to guess what happens now. What I saved up, he stole. I sowed, he reaped. I beat the bushes, and he got the bird. All of these are sort of proverbial type linguistic turns, but they also sort of alter the typical meaning of the proverb, right? The one that we would be most familiar with today would be, as you sow, so shall you reap. In this case, Babio is saying, I did all the work of having Viola be a virgin, and Croesus gets the reward of that. It's weird. It's a weird bit. I'm not on board with it, but it is what it is. It's linguistically interesting, if ethically repugnant. But then he goes on. And this is where we really get into these sort of paradoxes. And these would be linguistically very interesting for people learning Latin. I live though lack a soul. He took it with her. I wonder how I'll live inanimate. I'm me and I am not. I'm dead but I speak. New Babio. I am not what I am. For nothing back to nothing, that is me. To be and not to be, that's my complaint. Woman shall always have a woman's heart. No, not a heart, since all women have two, and double-hearted means they're double-tongued. Duplicitous Viola taught me that. Who'd trust Viola, and yet who wouldn't trust? So again, it's all these sort of contradictions, this complicated sort of experience of this relationship. And because it's presented through these linguistic paradoxes, these complications and contradictions, it would be a really good learning tool.